The dive supervisor's voice came flat over the comms, the way men talk when they've already decided the answer to a question nobody asked. Send the small one down. If the line's fouled, she's the only one who fits the gap. He didn't say her name. He said the small one, and the two contractors on the dive platform grinned at each other, because that was the whole of what they knew about Petra Silahi. That she was small, that she went into places bigger men couldn't, that she came up quiet and said less. What they did not know was in her file, 3 pages of it sealed behind a clearance none of them held, and what those pages said was that the small one had once put a round through a moving target at 800 meters in a crosswind that should have made it impossible, and had done it while bleeding, and had not mentioned it since. She checked her regulator. She did not react to the small one. She had stopped reacting to it years ago. The way you stop hearing a clock you've lived with. But she filed it, the same way she filed everything, in the flat, calm place behind her eyes, where nothing got lost and nothing got forgiven until it earned forgiving. Down the coast, 40 kilometers north where the water went from green to the deep, colorless blue, a man she would meet before the night was over was already loading magazines into a canvas bag, counting them twice, and telling himself it would be quick. He did not know about the small one either. That was going to be the last mistake he made as a free man, and he was going to make it in about 6 hours, and Petra Silahi was going to be underwater when it started, blind to the sky, 60 feet down with a fouled mooring line in her hands, and no idea that the war was about to come find her through the surface like a stone dropped into her silence. She rolled backward off the platform, and the sea took her. Before we go under with her, because that is where this story lives, in the space between one breath and the surface she could not reach. Do something for me. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments the city you're listening from, because I read them and it stuns me how far this thing travels. One voice in the dark reaching people I will never meet. Stay to the end. There is a moment near the finish. A single shot taken from a place no shooter is supposed to be able to take it from. With the light dying, and a man begging her over a radio he swore he'd never key. And if you leave early, you will miss how she answers him. You do not want to miss how she answers him. Stay. The firebase was called Handline, a name somebody in a planning office thought was clever, stuck on a spit of reclaimed rock and old coral, where a coastal shelf dropped away into water deep enough to hide anything. It was hot, the way the coast is always hot, a wet, heavy heat that sat on your chest and did not move, and the light came off the water in flat white sheets that made everyone squint and nobody happy. Petra had been there 11 weeks. She was a combat diver by trade and a marksman by a history almost nobody at Handline knew, seconded to a joint maritime interdiction unit because she could do the underwater work, hull inspections, mooring repair, clearing the fouled lines that the current wrapped around the pier stanchions like the sea was trying to strangle the place. That was the job on paper. She was good at it. She was better at the thing that wasn't on paper, and the reason it wasn't on paper was a woman named Dr. Ines Halloran, who had not been a soldier at all. Ines had run a marine research station on the far south coast when Petra was 19 and going nowhere, a dropout deckhand with steady hands and a temper she didn't know what to do with. Ines hired her to tend the station's small boat, and ended up teaching her everything. Not shooting, not at first, but stillness. Ines was a freediver, one of the best in the region before her knees gave out, and she taught Petra how to drop her heart rate on purpose, how to live in the long quiet between breaths, how to make her body a thing she commanded instead of a thing that panicked. The shooting came later, and it came because Ines had a second life nobody talked about, a decade in a uniform before the research station, and when she saw how Petra's hands went still under pressure, she said the words Petra still heard, "You don't aim with your eyes. You aim with your pulse. Put the shot in the gap between 2 heartbeats, and the world can shake all it wants." Ines was not dead. That was the thing people got wrong when they imagined where a skill like Petra's came from. They imagined a grave. Ines was alive, 70 years old and sharp as a hook, running a dive school 400 kilometers south, and every time Petra did the impossible, she did it partly to have something true to tell the old woman on the phone. She did not carry a keepsake. She carried a breathing pattern, 4 counts down and 8 counts out, the rhythm Ines drilled into her until it was more hers than her own name, and it was the only thing she ever took to the water or the rifle both. The 2 contractors, the ones who grinned, were named Doss and a broad Afrikaner everyone called Baki. They were not cruel men, only careless ones, and careless is its own kind of cruelty when it's aimed at someone 11 weeks running. Doss had a habit of narrating her, loudly, whenever she suited up. "There she goes, the fish. Hope the line's not too heavy for you, love." She'd clip her fins and say nothing. Once, early on, Baki had reached to check her gear like she was a rookie, and she'd caught his wrist without looking, held it a half-second, let it go. He'd laughed it off. He remembered it, though. Somewhere under the careless he'd filed the strength of that grip and not known what to do with it. The man who ran Handline was a major named Coyle, and Coyle's sin was not cruelty either. It was silence. He'd heard Doss narrate her a dozen times and said nothing, because saying something cost effort, and the narration cost him nothing, and that arithmetic is how good men enable small evils every day of the world. Coyle had read her file. He knew what the sealed pages said, and he had decided, in the quiet way men decide things they'll later have to answer for, that the file was probably exaggerated, and the diver was probably just a diver, and he let the small one stand, because contesting it would have meant admitting he'd read 3 pages he wasn't supposed to discuss. There was a cook at Handline, a local hire named Reza, older, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a fishing axis, decades gone. Reza watched people the way men who've lost things watch the sea, carefully, for what it might take next. He'd seen Petra surface one evening after a bad dive, a line repair in a current that had pinned her against a stanchion for 90 seconds, and he'd seen how she came up, not gasping, not shaking, but slow, deliberate, her face empty of the panic that should have been there. He'd handed her tea without a word. He told Doss the next morning, in his careful English, "That one is not small." Doss laughed. Reza didn't. He went back to his pots, and he waited, because he'd seen something the others hadn't, and he knew the sea would prove him right eventually. The sea always did. The dive that morning was routine. A supply lighter had dragged its mooring in the night and fouled 2 lines around the outer stanchion, and someone had to go down and clear them before the whole mess tore the cleat out of the concrete. Petra went down. The water closed over her, and the noise of Handline vanished, replaced by the deep hum of her own slowed pulse and the tick of the current against her mask. 60 feet. The lines were a snarl of poly rope and cable, wrapped and back-wrapped, and she got her knife into the first coil and began the patient work of freeing it. 4 counts down, 8 counts out, the world reduced to rope and pressure and the small sounds of her own body. She did not hear the boats come. 60 feet of seawater is a wall against sound, and the first she knew of any of it was a concussion she felt in her chest more than heard, a deep, flat thud that punched through the water and made the stanchion ring under her hand. She looked up. Through 60 feet of green she saw the surface flash, once, twice, the unmistakable strobe of muzzle flash seen from below, and the black darts of boats crossing the light, and she understood with total clarity and total calm that the war had arrived at Handline while she was underwater, and that she was the only person on the entire base who was, at this moment, in exactly the wrong place and the only right one. Handline was under assault. A dozen fighters in 4 fast boats had come out of the north with the sunrise behind them, and they'd hit the pier and the fuel point and the comms shack in the first 90 seconds, and Doss was already down, and Baki was pinned behind the concrete lip of the loading ramp with a round through his shoulder, and Coyle was in the operations hut screaming into a radio that answered him with static. The relief element was 40 minutes out. 40 minutes. And Petra Silahi was coming up the mooring line hand over hand with a dive knife and no gun and a heart rate of 41, into the worst 40 minutes Handline would ever see. She did not surface at the pier. She surfaced in the shadow of the loading ramp, silent, only her eyes above the water, and she read it the way Ines had taught her to read a reef. Not all at once, but in pieces, threat by threat. 4 boats. Three still crewed at the waterline. Fighters up on the pier moving toward the operations hut, where Coyle's voice was still going. Backy behind the ramp, alive, bleeding, his rifle dry firing because he'd burned his magazine in panic. She was 10 feet from him. She came out of the water without a splash and was beside him before he registered she was there, and when he swung the empty rifle toward her on reflex, she took it from his hands, the way you take a toy from a child, stripped the dead magazine, and held out her palm. "Ammo," she said. One word. He stared at her. "Ammo," she said again, and something in her flat voice cut through his shock, and he fumbled a spare magazine off his rig and put it in her hand. She seated it, chambered around. The bolt sang forward with a sound Backy would hear in his sleep for years, a clean metallic snap against the wet thunder of gunfire, and she came up over the concrete lip for 1 second, no more. The first shot she fired at handline took a fighter off the pier at 40 meters, center mass, and he went into the water and did not come up. She was down again before the man beside him understood his friend was gone. This is the part the surface dwellers never understand about someone who lives in the long quiet between breaths. She was not fast, because she hurried. She was fast, because she wasted nothing. Backy, flat against the concrete with his ruined shoulder, heard her breathing, 4 counts down, 8 counts out, and heard the rifle speak twice more, spaced and deliberate, and each time it spoke a voice on the pier stopped. "That's 3, Backy whispered, not because anyone needed the count, but because his mind had grabbed onto her rhythm, like a man grabbing a rail. 3. She keyed the radio on Backy's rig. Coyle was still transmitting on the command net, still calling for a relief that couldn't hear him. And into that channel came a voice he did not recognize at first, because he'd never heard it carry. "Handline. This is Silahi. I'm mobile on the pier side. Stay off the net." Clipped. Certain. In the operations hut, Coyle froze with the handset against his cheek, because the diver, the small one, the line clearer, had just told him to shut up on his own command net in a voice that sounded like it had done this 100 times, and the worst part, the part that landed in his gut like a stone, was that he obeyed. What followed was not a firefight. A firefight is 2 sides trading fear. This was one side doing math. Petra moved off the ramp and along the shadow line of the fuel bund, low, the rifle up, and she took the pier apart in pieces. A fighter turned a corner into her, and she fired once and stepped over him without slowing. 2 more had set up behind the comms shack with a belt-fed gun, and she couldn't reach them from the ground, so she went up a stack of fuel drums, exposed for the 4 seconds it took to climb, and in those 4 seconds the world went slow the way it always did. She saw the gunner swing the belt-fed toward her, saw the muzzle come around, saw the second man reaching for the fighter's shoulder to point her out. She heard the deep hammer of the gun start to traverse, felt the concussion of it in the drums under her hands, felt the sweat sheet down her spine and the sun hard on her wet shoulders, and she calculated, not in words, in something faster than words, that she had 1 count before the belt reached her, and that 1 count was enough. She fired from the top of the drums, falling, the shot taking the gunner as she dropped, and hit the ground rolling as the belt-fed's rounds walked across the space where she'd been, and punched through the drums with a sound like a giant knocking to come in. Fuel poured from the holes. The second man rose to find her, and she was already there, below him, and she did not miss. "That's 6, Backy's voice said in her ear, ragged, awed. 6, where are you? Over." She didn't answer. She was moving. 2 boats at the waterline had realized the pier was going wrong and were putting men ashore to fix it. Petra reached the end of the fuel bund and had to cross open ground to reach the operations hut where Coyle and 2 wounded soldiers were pinned, and the open ground was covered by a fighter with a scoped rifle set up on the breakwater, and she knew he was there because she saw his glint before he saw her. This was the second time the world went slow. She was in the open for 11 steps. She felt the first round go past her cheek before she heard it, a snap of displaced air like a wasp the size of a fist, and she did not stop or flinch or change her pace, because changing her pace is how you die. She ran the 11 steps at a dead sprint, while the marksman on the breakwater worked his bolt, and she felt the second round tug her dive suit at the hip without breaking skin, and she reached the hut wall and put her back against it and breathed, 4 down, 8 out, and heard Coyle inside saying her name into the radio like a prayer he didn't believe would be answered. She keyed once. Inside in 5. Don't shoot the door. Then she leaned out low, found the glint on the breakwater, and ended the marksman with a single shot before he could work his bolt a third time. 7, Backy breathed. She came through the door of the operations hut low and fast and found Coyle on the floor with a pistol shaking in his hand and 2 soldiers down but breathing, and one of them was a signalman named Theodore, 26 years old, with a wife 8 months pregnant in a town 400 kilometers south, and Theodore had taken a round through the thigh and the leg was bad, the blood coming steady and dark, and his face had gone the gray of a man leaving. Petra dropped the rifle and was on her knees beside him before Coyle could speak, and her hands, the same hands that had just emptied a pier, went to the wound with a diver's precise economy, finding the pressure point high in the groin and bearing down with the exact force needed and no more. Theodore's eyes found her face. He was young and he was frightened, and he asked her the only question that mattered, the one people ask when the gray comes up in them, his voice very small under the gunfire outside. Am I going to see her? The baby. Petra did not look away from the wound. She did not soften her voice or fill it with false warmth. She said 4 words, flat and certain as a stone laid on a scale. You'll hold your kid. Not I think, not I hope. A fact, stated. And Theodore believed her, because you could not hear that voice and not believe it. And something in him steadied and stopped leaving. She took his hand and pressed it where hers had been. Push here, just here. Don't let go. He nodded. She was already picking the rifle back up. That's the whole reason people like you exist, Coyle said from the floor, hoarse, staring at her. She didn't answer. She was counting boats through the window. The relief came at 31 minutes, not 40. 2 helicopters and a fast boat. And the fighters who could still run ran, and the ones who couldn't put their hands up, and it was over. Handline held. The medics took Theodore, and his pulse was thin, but it was there, and as they carried him past, he found Petra with his eyes, and she gave him the smallest nod, a promise renewed, and he was gone, toward the helicopter and the 400 kilometers between him and the room where his child would be born. Backy sat against the ramp with a medic working his shoulder and told anyone who'd listen she came up out of the water and cleared the whole pier. The whole pier. I counted. The count was 7. Everyone heard it. Nobody quite believed it, and that not believing is a thing that was going to matter very much before the day was done, because it was not done. That was the mistake everyone at Handline made in the 90 minutes after the relief landed. They thought the story was over. They thought the water had given up its worst. And they were wrong, because 40 kilometers north, the man with the canvas bag of magazines had been watching Handline through a spotting scope the whole time, and he was not a fighter. He was the one who'd sent them. His name was Adam Castrati, and he had 1 boat left and 1 card left to play. And he played it at noon when the base was still bleeding and half organized, when a supply helicopter lifted off the Handline pad carrying 6 people, 4 of them wounded, one of them Theodore, bound for the field hospital down the coast. And Castrati's last boat came out of a cove 800 meters offshore and put a rocket into the helicopter's tail as it cleared the water. It did not go down clean. The pilot, a woman named Officer Halide Osgur, fought it, and instead of dropping into the sea, it slewed and came down hard on the outer breakwater, the long finger of rock and rusted piling that reached half a kilometer out from Handline into the deep water, and it crashed there on its side, with its rotor gone, and its 6 souls trapped inside, and the tide coming in around it. And Castrati's boat, which had 1 more rocket and a heavy gun, began motoring in toward the wreck to finish what it started, because a wounded helicopter full of survivors on an exposed rock was exactly the kind of thing that finished a base's spirit, and Castrati understood spirit and meant to break it. The breakwater was 800 meters out. The helicopter was on its side at the very end of it, survivors moving inside, Theodore among them. Castrati's boat was closing from the seaward side, and in 90 seconds it would round the last piling and have a clean line to the wreck, and there was nothing at handline that could reach it in time. The helicopters were gone. The fast boat had chased the fighters north, and the only weapon on the base with the range was a rifle, and the only shooter was a diver with 7 kills and a heart rate of 41, and the shot was 800 meters over open water into a moving boat in a crosswind coming off the sea. They set her up on the highest point of handline, the old range tower, and Coyle stood behind her with the spotting scope, and his hands shaking, because now, finally, at the worst possible moment, he was going to have to trust the 3 sealed pages he'd decided were exaggerated. There was no ally to call her wind. Backy was down. Doss was dead. The spotter should have been a trained man with a data book, and there wasn't one, so Petra did the thing that made the sealed pages real. She became her own spotter, and she read the water. This is the part that matters, so listen. She did not wait for a gap in the wind, because there was no gap coming. The crosswind was steady and mean, and would not lull. What she read instead was the boat. Castrati was running fast and hard toward the wreck, and a boat at speed in a crosswind does not travel straight. It crabs and it corrects, crabs and corrects, and the correction is a rhythm a man's hands make, without his mind knowing it. Petra watched him crab and correct twice through the scope, and understood that at the moment he made his correction, for a fraction of a second, the boat's line and the wind's line canceled. The hull turned just enough into the wind that the crosswind became a headwind, and the drift went to nothing, and in that fraction of a second, the 800-meter shot became a shot she could make, if she fired, not when she saw the correction, but a quarter second before it, on the anticipation, on the read. "Talk to me," Coyle said, low. "He crabs left, corrects right," she said. "On the correction, the wind dies. I fire before he corrects," she breathed. 4 down. 1 chance. He's inside 400 by the 3rd crab. Then his gun reaches the wreck. Meaning she had 2 crabs to read and the 3rd to shoot, and if she missed the 3rd there would not be a 4th, because by then Castrati's heavy gun would be tearing through the helicopter, and Theodore and Officer Osger and 4 others, and the small one would have to live with having watched it through a scope. The radio crackled. And then, over the command net, came a voice nobody expected, because Adem Castrati had a radio too, and he'd found the handline frequency, and he keyed it not to gloat, but because he'd seen the glint of her scope on the range tower, and he understood, the way one professional recognizes another, exactly what was being set up, and it frightened him enough to try the only thing left. His voice came halting, accented, and it cost him something audible to say it. "Tower, I see you. You will not make this. Nobody makes this." A pause, the boat's engine howling under his words. "Let me pass. Let me pass," and I put the gun down. "There are your people on that rock." He was not asking for mercy. He was trying to buy the fraction of a second her concentration lived in, and Petra knew it, and she did not answer him, because answering costs breath, and breath was the shot. Coyle answered for her, his voice cracking. "She's not going to talk to you." And every man on the range tower, every soldier in earshot on the base below, heard the enemy commander beg the diver to let him pass, and heard the silence she gave him back, and understood that the small one held all 6 of those lives in the 4 counts of a single breath. First crab. She watched him drift left, watched his hands bring the boat right, watched the drift go to nothing for a quarter second and pass. She did not fire. She was reading. Second crab. Left, and correct, and the still point, and passed. She had it now. The rhythm, the length of it, the exact beat where the wind died against the hull. Her pulse dropped. 41. 40. The world narrowed to the boat and the crosshair, and the Count Enos had put in her 20 years ago on a research boat, 400 kilometers south. 4 down, 8 out. Put the shot in the gap between 2 heartbeats, and the world can shake all it wants. The wind pushed the tower. The sun beat off the water. Castrati's boat rounded the second-to-last piling and lined up for its run at the wreck, and his heavy gun swung forward, and this was the 3rd crab, the last one, the only one, and Petra Silahi stopped breathing at the bottom of her exhale, in the long, still place between one heartbeat and the next, and she did not fire when she saw the boat drift left. She fired a quarter second before he corrected, on the anticipation, into a piece of water where the boat was not yet but was about to be, trusting the reed over the sight. And the round left the barrel and crossed 800 meters of moving air in a little under a second. And in that second the boat crabbed and corrected exactly as she'd read it, turned its hull that last few degrees into the wind, and arrived in the still point at the same instant the round did. It took Castrati off the helm. The boat, unmanned at speed, slewed hard and broached and rolled, and its one rocket and its heavy gun went into the sea with it 200 meters short of the breakwater, and the wreck on the rock with its 6 souls sat untouched in the sudden enormous quiet, and on the range tower Major Coyle lowered the spotting scope with a hand he could not make stop and said, to no one, in a voice with nothing left in it, 800 meters. Moving boat, she called the wind off his own steering. Nobody on the tower said anything. There was nothing to say. She had done the thing the sealed pages said she could do, and they had watched her do it, and the watching had rearranged something permanent in every one of them. Down on the base, when the story reached the relief soldiers who hadn't seen it, they said it was a lie. They said no one makes an 800-meter shot on a moving boat in that wind, that Castrati's boat had swamped on its own, that the diver got lucky and the major was covering for a coincidence. And the not believing might have stood, except for 3 things that came together over the next day. The range tower had a hardened observation camera that logged everything in its arc, and the camera had caught the boat, the still point, the impact, and the timestamp on the frame where Castrati left the helm matched the timestamp on Petra's rifle log to within the travel time of the round. A machine's cold arithmetic that no coincidence could fake. The recovery team that went out to the swamped boat found Castrati and found the round, and the round told its own story about where it had come from and how. And Officer Osger, the pilot, who had watched the whole thing through the shattered windscreen of her wrecked aircraft while holding a tourniquet on her own co-pilot, gave a statement in a flat professional voice that matched the camera and the log frame for frame, and Osger was not a woman anyone accused of covering for coincidence. 3 accounts, 1 machine, 1 recovered round, all saying the same impossible thing. The lie died. What replaced it was quieter and heavier, the thing soldiers feel when they realize the person who'd been narrated as the small one had been, the whole time, the most dangerous individual on the base. They found Adem Castrati alive. The round had not killed him. It had taken him off the helm and the sea had done the rest, and the recovery team pulled him half-drowned from the swamped hull and he lived. And 2 days later, when he could stand, he asked to see her. They brought him to the pier where she was checking dive gear because the mooring lines still needed clearing and the work did not stop for anyone, and he stood in front of her with his wrists bound and his face gray and did the hardest thing a man like him ever does. He did not recite his crimes. He did not list the base he'd attacked or the men he'd sent or the helicopter he'd shot from the sky. He looked at the small woman coiling a dive line and he said, in his halting accent, the words breaking and restarting because they came up through everything he'd believed about who was dangerous and who was not. I have, my whole life, I look at people and I know. I know who to fear. He stopped. His jaw worked. I looked at you on that tower and I did not know. I keyed the radio because I was afraid, and I told myself it was a trick, that you could not. His voice went to almost nothing. You could. I was wrong about, and here the sentence broke entirely and he did not finish it, because the thing he was wrong about was too large to fit in a sentence, and he simply stood there having admitted it, humbled all the way down, a man who'd mistaken smallness for weakness his entire life, and been corrected at 800 meters. Petra looked at him for a long moment. She did not gloat. She did not forgive him either, because some things aren't hers to forgive. The men he'd sent had families too. She gave him 2 words, flat and even, the only 2 the moment could hold. I know, and it was not cruelty, and it was not comfort. It was just the truth, handed to him the way she handed everything, without decoration, and it undid him more completely than any speech could have. Coyle came to her that evening. He did not make a ceremony of it, because he'd learned something about her in the arithmetic of that day, and he knew she'd hate a ceremony. He just stood beside her at the water's edge and said what he had to say, the admission costing him the thing that admissions cost men who enabled a wrong by staying quiet. I read your file 11 weeks ago. I decided it was exaggerated. I let them call you the small one, because contesting it meant admitting I'd read pages I shouldn't discuss. And that was cowardice, and it was mine. He looked at the sea. You'll have your own element, your own selection of divers, your own tasking, answerable to me and no one below. I should have given it to you the day you arrived. She took the recognition the way she took everything, with a short nod and level eyes. That was all. It was enough. Reza the cook found her later, at the tea urn, and he did not say anything grand. He'd been right, and being right about the sea, and the people who moved through it, was its own quiet reward for a man who'd lost 2 fingers to it and stayed anyway. He poured her tea and he looked at her with the careful eyes of a man who watches for what the water will take next, and he said, in his slow English, the thing he'd known since the evening he watched her surface without panic. I told him. The first week. I told Doss. That one is not small. He put the tea in her hands. The sea knows. The sea always knows. And Petra, who did not smile in public, who kept the warm things behind the flat, calm place where nothing got lost, allowed him the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth, the one private warm thing she'd let out all day, because Reza had seen her before any of them and had needed no proof. Theodore lived. The field hospital held his pulse and the surgeons kept his leg, and 6 weeks later, 400 kilometers south, his wife had their daughter, and Theodore held his kid exactly as a diver had promised him he would, on the floor of an operations hut, with the world coming apart outside. He sent word back to Handline the only way he could. A photograph passed hand to hand up the coast until it reached the pier. A tired man in a hospital chair with a small bundle against his chest, and 3 words written on the back in unsteady pen. She was right. Petra kept the photograph. It was the only thing she kept. She was diving again within the week, because the lines still fouled, and the current still tried to strangle the place, and the work was hers now, in a way it hadn't been before. She rolled backward off the platform the way she always did, and the sea took her, and 60 feet down in the green quiet, she did the thing Enos had taught her 20 years before, 4 counts down and 8 counts out, her heart slowing to the long, patient rhythm of a woman entirely at home in the space between breaths. 40 kilometers north, the cove where Castrati had waited was empty now. His certainty about who to fear collapsed into a cell and a memory, and the sea above Petra Silahi closed over her without a ripple, and she went down into it the way she did everything, without a splash, without a word, the small one who was never small, aiming with her pulse in the one place on earth where nobody would ever again make the mistake of looking at her and seeing only how little of her there was.